Beard gets it exactly right at the beginning of this chapter. There is something just inherently fun and exciting to be walking on the very streets where the Pompeians themselves walked. To cross the streets on their stepping stones, to see the ruts that their carts made, is to most fully realize that we are literally walking in their footsteps. Pompeii is the world's greatest outdoor museum, which is what we want all museums to be. We want to be taken back to the time and place of the history that the museum shows us, and Pompeii's streets do that almost better than anything I know. The houses can sometimes actually be a bit of a disappointment. Paintings faded or carted off to the museum, walls and roofs only partially intact, but the streets are exactly the way they were for the Pompeians in 79 AD, minus a few phalluses that were once there, carved in low relief on the flagstone, but were chipped away by some easily offended archaeologists. You can see the outline where they chipped away this raised phallus. Beard casts doubt on whether the two surviving street relief phalluses were intended to lead a visitor to the brothel. Here is one that has not been chipped away. You have to admit that they would work quite well as pointing devices, and these two that I've shown you did in fact point in the direction of the brothel, though they would also take you to many other places along the way. Beard notes that the phallus was a ubiquitous symbol in Pompeii, and I think it's worth taking a closer look. The public display of the phallus and the range of possible associations and meanings make street life in Pompeii seem very different from our own society. First, there are several clay or stone plaques throughout the city, and the framed phallus is the most popular theme. There are more than a dozen of these throughout the city. They are set into walls that face onto public streets. They are clearly intended to be seen. This one is about 8 feet off the ground and quite visible in its frame, and they were usually placed on walls by street corners or near entrances. Here is another with a little gabled roof over it. This one is my favorite. It's not a plaque per se, but is carved from a solid block that is part of a wall. It looks like a little round temple with a phallus in the place of a god to be worshipped, and I think I see wings on it. Then little phalluses stick out from the corners of the pediment. The usual explanation for the display of the phallus is that it is a symbol of good luck and fertility. It does seem that the Romans thought of crossroads and thresholds as potentially dangerous spaces, so perhaps there is something to this idea of the phallus as an apotropaic object, something that as a symbol of strength and good luck could ward off evil. Some of the phalluses are transformed into little figures of their own. This plaque shows the phallus as a bird. Some of you might be reminded of Catullus's Passer poem, where the bird may be a symbol of his own penis. Here we see 4 dancing phalluses. I love their little testicle feet, which frame a dice cup. So clearly they were hoping to bring good luck here. In fact, the building may have been an inn or a bar, a place where customers would typically play dice. Another inscription found in this building, one of the painted election posters, even says that the dice throwers ask you to support Gnaeus Helvius for Aedile. Strangest of all is this man riding his own phallus like a horse. This is a famous phallus plaque. It comes from a bakery and was placed over the oven. The association between rising bread and the phallus is obvious enough, but the real treat here is the inscription. It reads, Hic habitat felicitas. Here lives happiness. It strikes me as so characteristically Roman, the humor and the directness of it. And finally, there were several phalluses that stuck out from the walls. This one is preserved in the museum. And here is another one still in place over a narrow window very close to the brothel. Whether these would have had similar associations of good luck, or whether they marked the cubicles of prostitutes, as the local guides like to speculate, we will never know. One of the things that Beard focuses on concerning street life was the water system. Remember that great scene from Monty Python's Life of Brian, when the Jewish rebels angrily ask what they ever got from the Romans? Someone in the crowd immediately pipes up, "The aqueduct." Another chimes in, "Sanitation." A third says, "Irrigation." A fourth says, "Public baths." It's a great moment in part because it must have been true. A major benefit of becoming part of the Roman Empire was that you would probably soon get access to fresh running water. To go from a cistern system to running water would have improved a person's urban experience tenfold. The Romans were brilliant engineers and spared no expense building aqueducts to bring water from springs in the mountains down to cities. The same was true for Pompeii. We don't know whether they got their aqueduct at the time of Sulla's resettlement of the city or later during the time of Augustus, but it definitely was an upgrade that can be attributed to the Romans. The aqueducts worked entirely by gravity, which is why they had to find springs in the mountains, and they utilized gravity even when the water had been brought down to the city walls. Do you see at the top of this topographical map of Pompeii the 43, which indicates the meters above sea level? That's the Vesuvian Gate, and it's very close to the highest point in Pompeii. All other parts of the city that the water will flow to are below the Vesuvian Gate, as much as 30 meters lower at the opposite end of the city. As a result, the Romans put the Castellum Aquae, where the aqueduct emptied its water, they put that right at this Vesuvian Gate, that highest point. Now this building here is sometimes described as a water tower, but its real purpose was to filter out things that might especially clog the pipe network within the city. In fact, you can see where the 3 outtake pipes are going to exit at the very base of the building there. Here is a photo of it from the inside, and you are looking at the opening where the aqueduct enters the Castellum Aquae. Water would probably have been only a few feet deep within this building, though it would have been continually pouring in. This plan and reconstruction gives you a good sense of how the filtering would have worked. There were various screens and a series of stepped levels which would have caught debris, and eventually the clean water spilled over and down into those 3 subsurface pipes that entered the city. It would have been someone's job, probably a public slave, to go into the Castellum Aquae and clean it out on a regular basis. The first place the water went was to one of the 12 water towers throughout the city. These were about 20 feet high, with a basin at the top. Here you can see the channel in the brickwork for the pipes that would have run up the column to fill the basin. These water towers in turn fed the more than 40 drinking fountains in all parts of the city. Here you can see the distribution of the fountains on the map. No one would have been more than 3 blocks away from clean, fresh drinking water. The basins were large enough for several to collect water at a time, and the spouts of these fountains were often decorated with a sculpted head. The water towers also sent water to the public baths and to a number of private houses that probably paid for the direct line. We do, however, hear from the ancient Roman writer on aqueducts, Frontinus, of people illegally running a line from an aqueduct to their own homes. It would have been a great luxury to have running water in your house, but because there was really no good way to ever shut it off, they used these direct lines mostly to run their glorious fountain displays. In this chapter, Beard makes much of how dirty Pompeii would have been, and the fact that the streets would have been used as a sort of open sewer to flush out the filth of the city. I have no doubt that the level of dirt, excrement, and all manner of bad smells in Pompeii would have shocked those of us living in the first world of the 21st century. But the same could be said for New York, London, and Rome up until the early 20th century. It's more a measurement of how far we've come. Despite the wonderful passage from satirists like Juvenal and Martial about people emptying chamber pots into the streets from upper floors, I would argue that the evidence can be read in a more positive manner. For example, the Romans had a publicly elected official, the aedile, whose job was to make sure the streets were kept clean. And there were public signs warning people not to defecate in the streets. Here is an example I photographed the last time I was there. It says, "Cacator," in other words, person who is about to take a shit. "May you be well enough to pass by this place." It is right outside the Vesuvian Gate. Undoubtedly they were dealing with an unpleasant reality, but at least they were trying to deal with the problem. It's also interesting that all of these signs are placed on long and mostly deserted back alleys. In other words, one of the few places in the city where people would actually try to do this. More misleading, I think, is Beard's suggestion that the human sewage of the city would have flowed into the streets. First, there were several public bathrooms in the city. They were connected to a sewer system that brought the waste outside the city, dumping it into the nearby river. Disgusting, I know, but better than having it flow down the streets. This is a public toilet from Pompeii, and originally the stone seats would have been supported by these struts over the channel of running water below. Second, private homes all had outhouses that basically worked as cesspools, allowing the liquid to seep deep underground, but holding the solid matter, which then would be removed periodically and probably used as compost in the fields. Third, the Romans are so cheap that they would have not allowed much waste to go to waste. I assume that animal manure would have been collected and used, and we know that fooleries actually kept pots outside their buildings to collect human urine, which was used in their cleaning process. Yes, the streets of the Roman world would have been dirty in a way that we would not accept, but they were cleaner than most of the civilized world had experienced before the empire and for a long time after. The last thing I want to focus on, was a brief remark Beard makes about the concentration of statues in the Forum at Pompeii, and how there would have been perhaps 500,000 statues in Rome at a time when the live population was only 1,000,000 people. She doesn't go on to show us many examples of statuary from Pompeii. Many of the finest bronzes were probably robbed out by people going back in soon after the disaster. Herculaneum, however, was buried by much denser material, which prevented people from getting back in there in ancient times. And it's there that we've recovered some spectacular bronze statues. Much marble statuary was recovered from Pompeii, but I thought I'd focus on the best examples of monumental bronzes that we have, because they have an unusually moving quality to them. Unfortunately, not much monumental bronze work survived from the rest of the Roman world. Shipwrecks are the other source that provide us with some nice examples of the art of bronze casting. Almost everything else that was created during the Roman period was almost all melted down at some point to be reused, sometimes for the most pedestrian things like cannons. The first few statues I'm showing you come from the so-called Villa of the Papyri, a fantastically wealthy seaside villa famous for its carbonized philosophical papyri that we are only now beginning to be able to read. The statuary from this site is amazing, and everything that I show you today is in that Naples Archaeological Museum, so there's another reason to go. The bronze statues are hollow, and created through what's called the lost wax method. Basically, the figure is created from a clay core, and then a wax overlay, and finally more clay over this. When this is fired, the wax runs out, and the artist is left with a mold into which he can pour molten bronze, and finish by cracking open the fired clay overlay. The thinness of these statues, about 3/4 of an inch, allowed them to show a great range of movement, as you can see here from these Danaids and the earlier runners. But I find that the most lifelike features of these statues comes from the way that the bronze reflects light and the incredible eyes that they set into the hollow bronze. Here is a close-up of one of those earlier runners. They feel alive as you move around them. The eyes tended to be made of a glass paste, and again, it's how they reflect and react to the light that makes them so compelling. The eyes don't often survive for these bronze statues, but when they do, you can really see why bronze sculpture was thought to be the highest of the arts. I think that the Romans must have thought a lot about how to bring these bronzes to life. Remember that the faun from the House of the Faun was in the pool of the atrium, and the light coming down through the ceiling and the water rippling in the pool, in combination with his dancing pose, would have made for one heck of a welcome to that house. There's some beautiful representations of gods in this villa of the Pompeii. Here's a wonderful drunken Dionysus leaning back over a wineskin. It looks like he's trying to make some point to whoever might listen to him. Here is a seated Hermes. There is not much to identify him as Hermes, except for his winged sandals. Otherwise, he looks like some sort of weary athlete. Similar is this image of Heracles holding his club and resting after his labors. I like how we see him older and heavier in this statue. All of these come from this private villa of the Pompeii, but there would of course have been many bronzes of gods in public as well. The last few bronzes I want to show you come from various public spaces in Herculaneum. The first two, in fact, are representations of emperors depicted with godlike attributes. This is Augustus, though the face is not quite the classic eternally young Augustus that we often see. He's got a somewhat similar posture to the famous Doryphorus, the spear-bearer, which we in Minnesota can see in marble at the MIA. I love that depiction of thunderbolts that he holds in his left hand. Here is Claudius, being represented as a god. It might seem strange to us to see these figures totally nude, but it was a common way to represent gods and heroes, and gave them an aura of strength and power. These next three statues come from outside the theater at Herculaneum, and it's interesting to see women represented. This is Antonia the Younger, who was a favorite niece of Augustus and the mother of the future emperor Claudius. Her head comes across as rather small amidst this great swath of her clothing. Of course, the women of the imperial household were never represented nude. The more clothing all the way down to the toes, the better. Here is Livia, Augustus's wife. I don't know what her gesture might mean here. It looks like she's surprised, but that wouldn't make sense. Perhaps it's a greeting or a gesture of compassion. This fellow was just a local bigwig, but he's obviously hit a home run to get a bronze statue of himself in the same group as the imperial family. Finally, there are a few beautiful marble equestrian statues that show another local who made good on the big stage of Rome. This is Marcus Nonius Balbus, who was from nearby Nuceria, but went to Rome and became praetor, the second highest elected position, and also governor of a province. He was celebrated in Herculaneum because he evidently became a benefactor and patron of the town. In return, they honored him with a statue. What is fascinating is that there is another practically identical statue of another Marcus Nonius Balbus in the town. The horses and riders are the same in every way, except you can see that this is the older man's son. So the town was intent to honor them both, and we should probably imagine that being a benefactor and a patron for these little towns in Italy often was an inherited honor and responsibility.